Hi, everyone. Hope you are all doing well. Just wanted to share some information about week four and speak specifically to a couple of things that aren't really detailed in the textbook. So I won't spend so much time reviewing things that you can read and talk a little bit more detail about some things that I think will help to tie it all together. So I first wanted to talk a little bit about we've been talking a lot about policy. We haven't been talking a lot about law, and um, we'll get to law here shortly. Speak a little bit in more detail about it, um, but I think it's important to have a few concepts of the law kind of under your belt at this point, and then moving forward, hopefully you'll be more knowledgeable if these aren't areas that you're already familiar with. So in our base of law in the U.S. Um, there are several different types, but one delineation is public law and private law. So public law is the type of law that deals with the relationships between individuals and the government, or individuals and government agencies. Um, so it's that connection, like for example, in the healthcare world, and this is what we deal with mostly in the healthcare world, unless uh, we're defending ourselves from a private law lawsuit, but generally in healthcare we're dealing with public law. So HIPAA is a public law, False Claims Act is a public law, Stark Law is a public law. So the types of things that govern the relationship between individuals and the government, and in the healthcare setting, we're talking about our healthcare organizations and government dollars typically. Most of those laws that I just mentioned all stem from the fact that healthcare organizations submit claims to the government, Medicare, Medicaid, federal health insurance plans, and that relationship is what is kind of enacts the the provisions of various elements of public law. So, for example, under HIPAA, there are certain payers that are not required to follow HIPAA's regulations because they're not involved in government payment. Work comp is a good example, in that they can have all sorts of different requirements that aren't the same as what HIPAA tells us, because there's no government exchange of funds with work comp. So property and casualty law, same kind of thing. Or property and casualty insurance. So there are times when public law is kind of implemented because of that relationship with the government. Private law is when we're talking about the rights and duties of private individuals. So, for example, I'm sitting here and looking out my window in my office at home, and um, let's say somebody is standing on my front yard with their dog and making a mess of my yard with their dog. Now, eventually, I might be able to prosecute them for trespassing, all sorts of different private laws that govern that interaction between individuals. So there's no government entity involved unless I call the police, and then that's a different element. But there's no government entity involved. It's just private laws govern the relationship between individuals as opposed to a relationship with the government. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. Now, where do any of these laws come from? Well, there's kind of three main sources of law. The original type of law that came with us to this country when this country was established, a million years ago, because it wasn't that long ago, but 1492, I guess, is when we're thinking about these types of things starting here in this country, was common law. So common law was what was common in Europe at the time, still is fairly common, and obviously it is here as well. And common law came from judges looking at a situation in making a decision. So oftentimes you'll see things. I know they pop up on Facebook and on Twitter and whatnot of funny laws from around the country or around the world, and many of those were rooted in common law. Some judge somewhere made a decision that said you can't take your dog outside between noon and 12:15 on Tuesdays or something, probably because there was something going on in that area and somebody sued because their dog was killed, or it was some horrible thing happened, and it caused that judge to make a decision about that case. Um, when those decisions are made, it creates common law. Now, sometimes common law is overridden by further common law. Sometimes common law is overridden by new statutes to clear up the situation. But oftentimes, common law just stands until somebody fights it. So, a common law rule that was created by a judicial decision many years ago. Actually, a good example is the Roe v. Wade abortion discussion, which I will get into that because I'm sure we have folks on both sides, and we're not here to debate that. But that's common law, because that was a law that was the rule of this country right now was based on the Supreme Court's decision at that point. That could be overridden by, as we're seeing now, by state laws, statutes, or by federal law, statutory law. So common law doesn't stand forever, but it will always give you, as an attorney, it'll always give you something to argue based on, and that's kind of the beauty of common law. Statutory law is what I was just talking about. These are the laws that come from our legislators. So we've already looked at that process, the legislative process, how these laws come about through examining things that we need to create law based on, the lobbying efforts, which we talked a bit about in week 3. But statutory law is that law that comes from our legislatures. So we'll just keep it at the federal level. The House, the Senate, they have to have a bill that matches. They both pass it, goes to the president. President can pass. He can veto, whatever. So that's statutory law, what we would commonly think of as law. The part of law that I want to talk a little bit more about is administrative law. And this is from a administration standpoint in the healthcare setting. This is the type of law that impacts us the most. So administrative law are elements of law, overall law, that come from administrative agencies. So one of these, good example, is CMS. So Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. They are an agency of the Department of Health and Human Services, which is a department of the federal government, and Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services will receive kind of an edict from a law. So I use HIPAA as an example a lot, and I apologize for that, but it's a clear demonstration of this. So HIPAA was passed in '96. That was here we go. Where's my cursor? That was a statutory law. So it was passed back in 1996. But then coming from that, there were several elements that needed to be implemented by, and we're talking about implementation this week as well, implemented by agencies. So what happened at that point were the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services and the Office for Civil Rights started writing rules. So they wrote a rule saying that certain code sets had to be used for submission of electronic claims. They wrote a rule that created the provider identification number system, because that was an element of HIPAA. They wrote a rule that said, information needs to be kept private. It needs to be accessible to patients. Those aspects of the HIPAA privacy rule. They wrote a rule about security, saying that if you have electronic health records, they need to be protected a certain way. You need to have physical, technical, and administrative safeguards in place, etc. So that's the privacy rule. So why would these be law? The whole point of law in the United States is that it's created, in this case, created by our legislators, people that we've chosen. So how is it fair that agencies can just choose what they want to create a law? Well, what it is that there's actually, I'm going to zip over to a website here. There is a process in place, and this is where I wanted to share some of this, because it doesn't go into this level of detail in the book. There is a process in place for us as an industry, as an individual, whatever it is that we might need to look at things as. There is a process where we can make comments on rules that come from government agencies. So in this case, you'll see this is the Federal Register website, federalregister.gov, and this is where you can come out every day. You can actually get I get an email every day that gives me the table of contents for the Federal Register for the day. But you can just come out here and browse it as well. They'll always have information at the top about the current issue. They'll tell you about notices. There are oftentimes notices for public comment that you'll find in here. But these are kind of the important things here related to it. It's all important, but this is what's related to our discussion, proposed rules, and then this is final rules. So I'm not going to look at one of these. Unfortunately, our current issue doesn't have anything of note really from CMS. This was yesterday's issue. I'm recording this on the 20th of July. But what is important is that you can go out here and you can browse. If you go up here to the top, browse, you can browse based on agency. So you could go to Health and Human Services. You can browse based on dates. So if you wanted, I clicked the wrong one, sorry. You can browse based on dates. So if you wanted to look at all of them from July, you could do that. And then you have the option of looking at it here on the screen. So I'll just bring it up and show you. You can look at it here, any documents in this format, or you can go to the original PDF format for the printed Federal Register, and it'll always be this 3-column, and you may have seen this, especially if you're currently working in a healthcare setting, you may have seen these before. Sometimes this itself is distributed to departments, etc. But this is what the Federal Register looks like. So, so why are we looking at this? Well, as I mentioned, administrative law is that type of law that there are elements that are submitted to the public for review, and when they submit something to the public for review, that's a Federal Register. They put it in the Federal Register, and they'll note it as a proposed rule. So if it's a proposed rule, we'll see it here, and I'll just scroll down. This particular one is about 2 new payment models. So this came out on the 18th, so just the other day. And this proposed rule is dealing with a couple of different new payment models for Medicare. So a radiation oncology model and an end-stage renal disease treatment choices model. So, so they'll give all of the details about these models. They'll typically give, at the top, they'll give kind of an executive summary of what they're doing. Then they'll give all sorts of provisions about the models, etc. And then if it's actually, I apologize for scrolling. I know that bothers some people's eyes. I can't grab a hold of it. Typically at the bottom, let's go to the PDF version. It's a little more compact. At the very bottom, again, apologize for scrolling. It's a very long rule, obviously, as you can see. If this rule is making a change to law, you'll find the actual, this is all background and commentary. Apologize, I should have set one of these up all the way to the end already. Okay, here we go. So, so this is where you see this. This is where they're actually making changes to public law. So this is probably, get back here. So this is 42 USC, so this is United States Code, and we are making changes to the Code of Federal Regulations under that. So 42 CFR Part 512 is what's being altered, and these are all the alterations to the rule. So I oftentimes, if I understand the situation of what they're looking at, I'll just zip down and look at the rule itself. And then if I don't understand something, or if I want more detail, then I'll just search within the document. You can always do a Control F and type in, if you wanted to look up beneficiary, which of course there'll be many of them, but it would highlight that word throughout the document, and you can go throughout and see it wherever that word is displayed. So, so why am I showing you this? Why do you care? This is the process of creating administrative law. So you would the government agency, in this case CMS, puts out this proposed rule, and then we have X amount of days to comment. So with this particular rule, we need to get comments into CMS by September 16th, 2019. And so what you would want to do is read through the document, and if it was something that you wanted to comment on, you can submit a formal comment, and then it will go here. Now, what happens is when the final rule does come out after they examine all the comments, make decisions, final rule is submitted, you will see, and let's see if we can see one here in this other. Don't know that I will see one that way. Let me do this. So here's a final rule. This came from back in June, but this is the, actually no, it's an extension of the timeline for the final rule. Okay, that's not a final rule. This is a final rule. So this one came about a little earlier in June, and it is updating the requirements for the PACE program, Programs of All-Inclusive Care for the Elderly. So this was submitted as a proposed rule. Then it was secondarily submitted back to all of us, the public, as a final rule. And and I'm not going to spend time scrolling through here, but as you scroll down through, you'll get to a section where they answer all of the comments. Or generally all of the comments. So if you send something off the wall, they're not going to answer that, but they try to answer as many comments. Okay, here's, I don't think this rule is fair because of this reason, and they'll answer that. They'll say, okay, this was altered in the rule, or no, we need to leave it this way, but here's why. So they tried to give you some background. So why do we care about these things? Well, these types of rules, and here's an example right here, these types of rules are really what govern, from the administrative side, the healthcare sector. So administrative law is much more important to us as an industry than those other types of law. Yes, we will deal with cases of tort law, which is a private law, but tort law is negligence and malpractice. So we will deal with those types of cases, but not so much. You may deal with that if you're a provider or if you are a lawyer for an organization, but as a manager in the healthcare sector, administrative law is really what you'll be focused on. So hopefully that makes sense. If you have any questions on it, please let me know. I just want to talk a little bit more about policy implementation. So this part of policy implementation is that rulemaking process. So, keep in mind, and we'll use HIPAA as an example again. They created that law, and then they needed to implement it. And I've mentioned that, I think, a couple times in the previous videos. So part of that is the rulemaking process. So the government is looking to implement that public law and push that out to organizations to implement. So it starts with an agency like CMS or NIH or the CDC, et cetera, and then it eventually makes its way to us in the industry. So if we go back and visit this little policy making template again from the textbook, we're over here now, designing and rulemaking process, and then the operating process comes to us as organizations in the U.S. And then this evaluating process here, operating and evaluating, that involves all sorts of organizations. I'll talk about that in a second. But it is this constant cycle. And that's why the administrative law process is nice, because in 6 months you can have a new law in the books. And it doesn't have to, it has to have come from some statutory law at some point, but it doesn't have to go through the process of having partisan discussions on both sides of the aisle for House or Senate approval, etc. So it still gives us input as a public, probably more input than we have in most lawmaking, but it also is a quicker process to get things moving forward. So all three branches of government share responsibility for policy implementation. The executive branch plays the central role, because you think about Department of Health and Human Services, that the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services serves on the President's cabinet. So all of that fits within the executive branch. So that administrative rule process or administrative law process is part of the executive branch. The legislative branch oversees, so they're more part of this kind of arrow here where we're going back and forth. And then the judicial branch referees, and we'll talk about that in a second. So executive branch organizations that we deal with commonly, HHS, Department of Justice, the EPA, the FDA, CMS, etc. So these folks are all involved in that implementation process. But CMS is really, unless you work in research or, work in drug manufacturing in the pharmaceutical industry, it's really CMS that we deal with most often in hospitals, long-term care agencies, physician practices, etc., payers. So really heavily regulated by CMS, and their purpose is to make sure that the industry is regulated appropriately, and then we must implement those regulations in the industry itself. The legislative branch, like I said, they oversee. So they're making sure that, for example, CMS, if they're writing a rule, the rule or the element that needs to be undertaken by those committees in the Senate and the House, etc., are to oversee that rulemaking process to make sure it adheres to what Congress intended. So if Congress says, "Hey, we want to put in place, we're going to pass a new law that says that everyone has to have insurance in this country," and then, which was similar to what the ACA did, and then if CMS or Department of Health and Human Services, overall, whatever agency, writes a rule, administrative law, that says, well, if you make a certain low amount of money, you don't have to have it. If you are between jobs, you don't have to have insurance. If they put caveats in there that was not intended in the original law, legislative branch can step in and say, whoa, that's not what we intended. You need to revise your process. So they have some insight and some oversight to that administrative rulemaking process. It's hopefully to improve efficiency and effectiveness, although I don't know that they do that much of that, especially when you're talking about a very heavy administrative law sector such as healthcare. But that is part of the purpose. And ultimately to implement or to ensure that implementation reflects the public interest. So most folks don't just sit around that aren't involved in this aspect of the industry. They don't sit around reading the Federal Register and making commentary. So it really, although the process is very transparent and public, most people don't get involved in it. This aspect here, the legislative branch work that needs to occur, is to make sure that those rules truly do represent the interests of their constituents. And that's why it's important for us as individuals in the United States to reach out to our legislators, but also that's where advocacy groups come in. And they'll reach out to legislators and say, a good example was when ICD-10 was being implemented. So implemented this new code set, and I think I've spoken a little bit about this as well. But very powerful lobbies came forward to the legislators and said, you need to not push this forward. Now, it was not statutory law that was pushing it forward. It was an administrative law element. It was a rule that was passed by CMS, secondary to HIPAA. But it was the legislative branch that stopped that from moving forward. They wrote new statutory law that stopped the implementation of ICD-10. Of course, it eventually did move forward. But so they felt there was enough advocacy on behalf of the provider community coming out and saying, we're not ready for this, you need to stop it, that the legislators did step in and stop it. Like I said, there are committees that have oversight, but also funding. So sometimes there are, like all of the Medicare regulations that are dealing with payment require funding appropriations. So sometimes they can hold back funds, and that will stop the implementation of a specific rule. So judicial branch involvement comes in when we're looking at challenges to certain rules. So a good example is it talks about administrative law judge work. And this particular slide talks about the EPA, but if you have ever worked in medical billing or have had a someone that you're maybe a family member or a friend that you're helping that has Medicare, you'll get to a certain level. It's the third level of appeal for a Medicare claim that goes to an administrative law judge. So they get involved in looking at the dissatisfaction of either providers or beneficiaries with regard to Medicare claims. And that is really looking at administrative law. The administrative law is what governs those aspects of how Medicare pays for things. And then the administrative law judge will look at it and say, this doesn't make any sense. And then he'll kind of set common law by overriding a certain thing. The judicial branch can also get involved just when there's some type of a rule that's being challenged in court. So maybe a large group will band together or a large hospital system will challenge an administrative law or even just a statutory law in court, and hopefully would be able to have the judge rule in a more impartial fashion on the what does this rule or does this law make sense. So that's where really the judge level, be it in the appeals world or be it in just looking at court challenges to rules, they are really there to be that kind of that impartial third party to examine the situation and make a decision based on that. CMS, as I already said, they are the implementing agency that we deal with most commonly in with regard to administrative law and rules and regulations secondary to statutory law, which is administrative law. But they provide health benefits for so many people in this country, be it Medicare, Medicaid, the CHIP program, the ACA here, but then also folks that work for the federal government. They're covered by government dollars, not managed by CMS, but government dollars. The military is government dollars. So the Department of Health and Human Services really oversees a large bucket of money for kind of driving the healthcare industry. So very important. This is why they are so interested in making sure that the rules make sense, but that it is highly regulated. So that's all I have there. Let me hop over here for 1 second. Hop into the classroom. So this week, in week 4, we have a Flipgrid, which is specific to the community health assessment in Allegheny County. That is available up here, and we want to talk about some of the different focus areas that are part of that assessment, and then how we can move that forward, how we can move those elements of those that community health assessment forward using health policy. So you may have looked at this. Actually, I don't think you guys have. We'll look at this community health assessment again in the population health class. But in this case, we're looking specifically at health policy. How can we, barriers and opportunities to promote the plan, mechanisms available to affect change. So that's where we're talking about the health policy pieces, advocacy, etc. There's also a writing assignment for this week. So there's a video up here that I would like you to watch. It's called Obama's Deal. And it has to do with the passage of the ACA and talking a little bit more about lobbying, because that's such a huge piece of what we deal with in the health policy sector. Based on what you've read in the textbook as well as the Obama's Deal video, I'm interested in knowing a little bit more your thoughts on these questions that are listed here. Finally, we do have a quiz this week as well, obviously. But I also want you to, in week 7, you'll have a final project that's due. And I would really like you to give some thought to a specific issue that impacts the health of individuals or of the population. I've given you some examples here like vaccines, marijuana use, motorcycle helmets, prescriptions of opioids, et cetera, et cetera. And you can choose anything. Actually, the types of things that we talked about in the discussion board in week 3 might be good examples too of things that you might want to consider policy around. But so what I want you to do is this week you're just going to be submitting your topic, but your final project is going to be to look at one of these specific topics, whichever one you want to choose, one of these or another one. And then you will be discussing what types of policy, legislation, regulation exists currently to address these, and how would you, what policy would you put in place? What I'm looking for is kind of a literature review of existing policy and then a proposal of a new policy to help fix the issue. So that's the type of thing I'm looking for. The final project will be a 5 to 7 page paper. The body will be 5 to 7 pages. But for this week, I'm just interested in your topic. So choose a topic here or choose something outside, and I'll give you some feedback as to whether I think that makes sense for a policy perspective. Sometimes people pick things that they're very passionate about, but there's really no policy to be created around that topic. So it's really important that you think about a topic that you're interested in, but that you think policy can help to regulate and improve the situation for that, whatever it is that you're choosing. And then I'll give you some feedback. In week 6, we'll be having a synchronous session, and we're actually going to discuss and debate these topics a little bit. Hopefully the point of picking your topic now is so that you can start your research, submit your paper in week 7, but we're going to be talking about the topics and maybe doing a little bit of debate on what you've already learned on these topics to help you prepare for that, putting the final touches on your paper for week 7. So that's all I've got. I look forward to chatting with everyone in the discussion boards about our community health assessment pieces. And other than that, let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.